Alright, what's going on everyone, and welcome to the Banned Deck series, where we discuss terribly broken, degenerate decks in Magic the Gathering's history that were so powerful they needed to be banned. Today we're talking about Birthing Pod, a deck that wasn't just powerful, but actually threatened the future of Magic card design, and that might sound hyperbolic, but that's actually one of the reasons it was banned. So let's take a look at the namesake card. It's a 4-mana artifact that you can pay to tap it and sacrifice a creature to search your library for a creature with mana value equal to 1 plus the sacrificed creature's mana value and put it straight on the battlefield. So basically, you can sacrifice a 1-drop to get a 2-drop, you can sacrifice a 2-drop to get a 3-drop, so on and so forth. Now this might seem clunky. I mean, it's a 4-mana artifact. It does not impact the board. It costs 2 mana to activate, but keep in mind, these are Phyrexian mana symbols, meaning you can pay 2 life for them, and this deck was filled with mana dorks like Birds of Paradise and Noble Hierarch. They tap to add mana, meaning turn 1 you can play a land and a mana producer, and on turn 2 you have 3 mana, you can pay 2 life, and there's your Birthing Pod. This isn't a do-nothing artifact that enters on turn 4, it's a do-nothing artifact that enters on turn 2. And at this point, if you're familiar with Creature Toolbox decks, you can imagine how overpowered this is. And if you aren't familiar, Creature Toolbox decks use cards like this to consistently find the exact creature they need at any given time. Like a toolbox, you reach in for the tool you need when you need it. So these decks are often filled with singleton copies of silver bullet creatures that shut down opposing decks. The idea is you just search for that particular creature that you need at that particular time, and you always have an answer for what your opponent's doing. It's sort of like playing your sideboard and your main deck from the start, except you also get to constantly tutor those sideboard cards when you need them. So once Birthing Pod hits the battlefield, you can start sacrificing the mana producers you used to cast it in the first place to start walking up the chain of mana costs to shut down your opponent's deck. So you have like Voice of Resurgence, which is a 2-mana 2/2 that punishes players for casting spells on your turn, so you get that against control decks. Also, if it dies or gets sacrificed to the pod, it puts out another token. Scavenging Ooze eats graveyards and could be searched up against Reanimator decks or Dredge decks, for example. You had Quizali Pride Mage, which destroys artifacts and enchantments. You have Spellskite, which is good against interactive decks. Once you get to the 3-drop slot, you can get like Kitchen Finks against burn decks because it gains a life. It also has Persist, so it re-enters, gains more life, and can be re-sacrificed to the pod. You have Eternal Witness, which is a great mid-range value card because you get something back from your graveyard. Sin Collector enters, rips out a card from your opponent's hand. Very useful against combo decks that need a specific set of cards to win. There's Orzhov Pontiff, which enters and gives all creatures either +1/+1 or -1/-1. So a great answer to token decks. Remember, this is the age of Lingering Souls, so it was very good. You had Rex Sage as well, which blows up artifacts and enchantments like the Pride Mage. In the 4 and 5-drop slots, you get stuff like Linvala, Siege Rhino, Shriek Maul. Linvala could turn off decks relying on activated abilities. Siege Rhino is a mid-range powerhouse that could turn the tide of battle if you're behind. You typically get this when you're just looking to start winning, and Shriek Maul blows up a creature. There's also Revelarch and Ranger of Eos. So both of these help restart your Birthing Pod chain. The first grabs 2 creatures that cost 2 or less from your graveyard, and the Ranger searches your library for 2 1-drops, because remember that pod makes you find something that costs 1 more mana than the sacrifice creature. So this helps you restart back at 1, so you can start walking up that chain of pod targets. Restoration Angel also played. It blinks a creature, so it can be used to re-trigger all these enter the battlefield effects. You would also see like Entomb Exarch, which returns something from your graveyard to your hand, or can rip out something from your opponent, so that's versatile. Wall of Roots was very common, just a brick wall that helps add mana. Just tons of stuff, and this might seem like a lot of creatures, but remember, it's just playing 1 or 2 copies of most of these, so it could search up exactly what it needed against specific decks. So yeah, the deck played Birthing Pod and a bunch of silver bullets, right? That's how it worked. You just always find the right answers to your opponent's deck and win that way. And no, that's not how it worked. Because if you have all the power in the world to dig through your deck for specific creatures, it just makes sense to play some combos, right? So there were multiple builds. Melira pod decks used Melira Sylvok Outcast alongside Kitchen Finks and Murderous Redcap. So the Finks and the Redcap have persist, meaning when they die, if they didn't have a -1/-1 counter, they re-enter the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter. So the idea, if these are playing fairly, is that you get them twice, they're smaller when they come back, and then they don't come back a second time. However, Melira says your creatures can't have -1/-1 counters on them. So this was already great value with the pod, right? You play Kitchen Finks, you gain 2 life, you sacrifice it, you get a new card from the pod, it re-enters, you gain some more life. But then Melira allows you to continuously sacrifice those, to continuously get more stuff, and also continuously gain life, or the red cap deals damage. So that all works pretty well, but of course, you just need a sacrifice outlet like Viscera Seer to go infinite, because you can sacrifice a persist creature, it re-enters without the counter, and then you can sacrifice it again, and it re-enters without the counter, so on and so forth. So Viscera Seer and Kitchen Finks was infinite life, and the Seer and the Murderous Redcap was infinite damage, and all of this was made very easy to assemble because Pod let you find specific pieces. If you have 2 out of the 3 cards, you just go find the other one, right? There were also Thune pod decks with Archangel of Thune and Spike Feeder. So the angel says whenever you gain life, you add a +1/+1 counter to all of your creatures. And the Spike Feeder enters with 2 counters. It can add counters to itself, but most importantly, you can remove a counter to gain 2 life. So you remove a counter, you gain 2, the Archangel sees that, puts a counter on everything, including the Spike Feeder, which you then remove for 2 life, and that's an infinite combo. Remove a counter, gain 2, get a counter, remove a counter, gain 2, get a counter. So this results in infinite life and a massively huge board. And then there were Kiki pod decks with Kiki Jiki and Deceiver Exarch. This is a classic combo. Kiki Jiki can tap to create a token copy of any creature you control, and then the Exarch says when it enters, you can either tap or untap a creature. So you tap Kiki Jiki, you make a token of Exarch, it enters, untaps Kiki Jiki, which then taps, makes another Exarch token, which untaps the Kiki Jiki, so on and so forth. That's another infinite combo, and this last one probably does the best to highlight the problem with these pod decks, because you notice that this combo is blue and red. It's an Izzet deck that's using a green artifact to assemble an infinite combo, and it doesn't even need green mana, right? It can pay 2 life for the Phyrexian mana symbol. And that was a major problem with Birthing Pod, is it really homogenized the metagame too much. Basically, every creature-based deck might as well have been a pod deck. Why would you play a creature-based deck and not have pod? And if you have pod, then you're automatically adding all the same silver bullet cards that every other deck is playing. So suddenly, you have like 5 or 6 different combo decks that before pod existed were just individual decks, but now they're all pod decks with all the same silver bullets with like 2 or 3 different cards that are different, just a different combo. The deck was powerful, of course, but it also just massively oversimplified the metagame because it blended every creature-based archetype into just a big Birthing Pod soup. So on January 2015, Wizards of the Coast announced that they were banning the card, and an interesting aspect of the ban is they stated that not only was the deck winning a significant portion of major tournaments, but they also said that the deck would just continue to grow in power as they printed new creatures. Like, basically, with the existence of this card and this deck, Wizards of the Coast was actually limited in how they could design creatures, because literally every single creature printed just powered up pod decks. I mean, sure, technically if you print a new aggro creature, that powers up aggro decks, but it doesn't power up ramp decks or stompy decks, right? It might not power up mid-range decks. I mean, heck, you could print a powerful red aggro creature, and that doesn't power up white aggro decks, right? But the problem with pod, because every single creature deck was now just a pod deck, that meant that literally every single creature just powered up one single deck, which was the pod creature decks. So having the design of the game be hampered by an artifact that was already too powerful in the metagame to begin with was never gonna last, and that's likely why Birthing Pod will also never be unbanned. People talk about unbannings all the time, and occasionally Birthing Pod comes up, but it's never going to happen, not because a pod deck would be overpowered, but just because the card's existence literally limits Wizards of the Coast ability to design creatures. So it's probably staying banned. I mean, it's not impossible it gets unbanned, but I wouldn't count on it ever coming back. So yeah, that's the story of modern pod decks. It literally did threaten the future of the game if it continued to exist, and it just had to be removed. So if you like this video and you want to see more like it, I have a playlist dedicated to these banned decks, and you can find a link to it in the description below, so check that out if you're interested. But in the meantime, thanks for watching. I hope this was interesting, and I will see you in the next one.